Chains, Chapter 16. Ruth fell asleep quick that night, my arms around her. I had washed out the blood from her kerchief and hung it to dry. There was a lump on her head, but it would go away. Madame's threats would not. I slowly pulled my arm out from under my sister. She sighed and curled up into a tiny ball. I had pondered the problems all day and half the night. No matter how many times I turned it around, I found the same answer. We had to flee the city. I sat up and pulled the blanket over Ruth, tucking it under her feet and then to keep her warm. The wings that could help spirit us away were hidden in the master's desk. I had to take the list. It would buy our freedom. But Bellingham would not listen, not after the incident with the linen chest. I had to deliver it straight to the army. The sound I had been waiting for broke through the low roar of Master Lockton's snores, starting up as the grandfather clock chimed midnight. I put on my shirt and made my way to the bottom of the stairs. The hour was upon me. 'Twas time to act. The moon was my friend. It lit up the library enough for me to make my way without stumbling into anything. The snuff jar stood on the corner of the desk. I held my breath as I lifted the lid and put my hand inside and slowly pulled out the keys. I crouched behind my desk and examined them in the moonlight. Only one was small enough to fit into the top drawer's lock. I inserted the key and turned it gently to the right. There was a small clunk. The drawer had slid open a hair. I forced myself to remain still and count to 20. Lockton's snores continued above, regular as waves crashing into the side of a ship. I pulled open the drawer and peered inside. It was crowded with abandoned quills and rusty tinderbox, and a few coins and pounds and notes, which I was sore tempted to take. I felt through the drawer with careful fingers. What had he done with the list? Was it in his coat pocket? I reached into the back of the drawer and pulled out a black hair ribbon. Had this been given to Goldbuttons for safekeeping? There. From the furthest reach in the drawer, I pulled out a single sheet, folded once. I held it up to the light, and the quill quickly read. It was the list of names. It was the mayor's was at the bottom, and it was titled, Committee to Preserve the King's Peace. I tucked the paper in my pocket and tied it tight and slipped it under the waistband of my skirt where it could not be seen. I closed and relocked the drawer and carefully returned the keys to their hiding place. I tiptoed through the house and slipped outside as quiet as a ghost. The air was hot and dripping, as if the city were wrapped into a wool blanket just pulling from a boiling point. I made my way along the streets, only to be seen by cats and rats and a slave hurrying by with a bundle on her head. Since she carried a lantern and no doubt had a pass from her master, she was allowed to be walking out after dark. I was not. The woman said nothing as she passed me, but started singing the second verse of Yankee Doodle in a strong voice which I thought curious indeed. I listened close to the words. Father and I went down to camp, along with Captain Gooding, and there we saw the men and boys, as thick as hasty pudding. She was sending a message. I dove behind a log barricade just as two soldiers turned the corner, talking intently to each other and sweeping the streets with their eyes. I had a quick prayer of thanks to the singing woman for her help. When the echoes of soldiers' boots had vanished, I moved on, staying away from the lights and the sentry fires, passing under the dark shadow of King George's statue in the Bowling Green, and hurrying to my destination. The battery was at the fort at the southern tip of the island, with high walls and cannons pointed over the water to discourage enemies. It was the headquarters of the Patriot Army in New York. Even if General Washington was elsewhere, I could find an officer who would understand the value of this list. I marched past the rows of tents set upon the grounds outside of the fort, trying very hard to ignore the men and the boys who stared as I walked by. As I neared the gate, a sentry stepped out and blocked my way. "Do you have a pass, girl?" I swallowed hard and tried to remember the name of the colonel who worked with Master Bellingham. Fagin? Jaden? McReadon? Well, a few of the soldiers were drinking their coffee outside of their tents had stopped talking to observe. Please, sir, I said politely and firm. I've come with an urgent message for Regan. For Colonel Regan, sir. Tell me, and I'll see that he gets it. I cannot. I must deliver it personally, sir. Who is your master? Telling a lie would not benefit me. A loyalist, sir, who would only beat me bloody if he knew I was here. He looked me over and yawned. Come on, then. I could use a walk to keep me awake. I followed him inside, past a room of men sleeping on the floor, along a hall to a small room where a low fire smoldered in a hearth, and a chair drawn up before it. The moonlight had broke free of the clouds again, and lay in the gray pools beneath the windows. A table stood by the door, where a heavy-set man scratched away on a piece of paper, his work lit by half a dozen candle stubs that would soon burn out. The soldier drew himself up to his full height. This girl has a message, sir. Claims it must be delivered in person. The man lifted his hand in the air and continued with what he was writing. He tried to make out what it was, but his scribble was dreadfully bad. Finally, he laid down his quill, moved his spectacles high upon his nose, and peered through them at me. What is it? He rasped. His voice sounded raw, like he had been run against a grater. An onion poultice was tied around his neck. I dropped in a polite curtsy. I have information for Colonel Regan. Who sent you? Who's your master? I cannot say. Then who will vouch for you? Ah, I vouch for myself, sir. I am new to the city, and only know a boy named Curzon. One caterpillar eyebrow lifted above the glass as he recognized the name. Bellingham's Curzon? He coughed loudly and sprayed drops of spittle on the page. He's all bluster. He dripped the quill into the ink pot and continued to write. Take her away, Sergeant. I'm too busy for this. My escort grabbed a hold of my arm. Come now. I tried to break free. Please, hear me out. I shook my arm. They want to kill him. I pulled with all my might and lost my footing. Both the sergeant and me stumbled against the table. The ink bottle turned over and poured across the table of papers. The sick man jumped up with a mighty curse and several ugly statements about my character. They want to kill the general. I finally pulled free of the sergeant's grasp. I have proof. The man was concerned only with rescuing his papers from spreading a pool of ink. Sergeant, remove this bird wit. Do not touch her, the commanding voice came from the center of the room. The sergeant stood at attention. The man with inky hands did too, swallowing hard and wincing at the pain in his throat. A figure rose from a high-backed chair that stood in front of the hearth. He wore a dark blue coat, an officer, with buttons and buckles that reflected the firelight. His features stayed in the shadows, but I could see a book in his left hand and a finger marking his page. Leave us, he ordered. Yes, sir, the sergeant said. As you wish, Colonel Regan, sir, said the man, whose clothes were stained by blue and the papers he had clutched to his chest. When the door was pulled open behind them, Colonel Regan returned to his seat. Come here, he told me. Show me what you've brought and tell me your story, but keep your voice low. The walls have ears. Yes, sir. My voice was strangulated a bit. The colonel tugged at his coat as he sat down. He was not wearing a wig, as most gentlemen did. His own hair was dark and pulled back into a neat queue and tied with a string. His eyes were sunk deep into his face, with dark hollows underneath them. Well? He set the book on his lap, fingers still marking the place he left off reading. I weighed my words before I spoke. I am in a position to trade with you, sir. What kind of trade? My sister and I were wrongfully taken from Rhode Island. I mean, to get us back there. You want passage home in exchange for what you know? Yes, I said, lifting my chin a little. Sir. He nodded gravely. If your information is as useful as you think it is, I shall personally look into your case, miss. That was far from a berth on a swift ship, but I had little choice. They planned to kill General Washington. He closed the book and set it on the floor and leaned forward on his elbows on his knees. Tell me all. I handed him a list and quickly told him everything I knew. He interrupted a few times with questions and had me repeat the mayor's words. Then he bade me to wait by the dying fire as he left the room, and soon reappeared with 4 other men, all clearly dragged from their beds. I was fighting to stay awake myself, but I repeated the story to the larger assembly. A quarrel began instantly, the arguments flying across the room. How do we know Lockton didn't send her with false stories? That's just a list of names. Anyone could have written it. I know the mayor's handwriting, and those are dyed in the wool of loyalists, every one. I don't believe they've turned a lifeguard. Those men are the finest we have. This is nonsense. I'm going back to bed. Her story confirms what we've heard from other sources. This from Colonel Regan. He explained that several spies had brought him the same rumor earlier that day. He walked into the hearth and looked at the glowing embers. All that remains is to decide what to do with this information. Who has the list? A man wearing his uniform coat over his nightshirt waved the paper in the air. Return it to the girl. Why on earth would we do that? He asked. I want her to plant it back where she found it. 'Tis best they believe that their plan is still secret. That improves our chances of rounding them up. The man handed the list back to me. I thought for a moment about tossing it on the fire, for it suddenly seemed frightfully dangerous, but I folded it back into my pocket. Do you think he'll be able to return it to his desk? Colonel Regan asked me. Yes, sir, I said. If you hear anything else, anything at all, you come and find me. Do you understand? Yes, sir, I said. I hesitated. And you'll soon help me and my sister get home. His eyes darted to his companions, then back to me. I shall do what is in my power, he promised. Thank you, sir. She'll need the code to get back into camp, said the man in the nightshirt. New regulations go out at dawn. Agreed. Colonel Regan bent down so that his face was level with mine. Do not tell this to another soul, on pain of death. Do you swear? I swear, I whispered. The code is ad strata. Repeat it, please. Ad strata? I had never heard such a word, but then again, I'd never spoken in code. 2 words. Ad astra. It's Latin. It means to the stars. Will you be able to remember it? I never forget a thing, sir.